Hello all, my name is Alves. I am the Violence Prevention Education Coordinator at the Phoenix Center at Auraria, and welcome to episode 2 of the Phoenix Cast. Today I am joined by 3 of our interns from the PCA office, 2 of our advocates, and 1 of our Violence Prevention Education interns, and we're so excited to be tackling the topic of misogyny and the villainization of Carole Baskin in Tiger King. So this will be a 2-part episode with different themes and topics. And now I'd like to go around and introduce our different speakers.
My name's Jenae. I am a victim advocate intern for the Phoenix Center at Auraria, and I am a undergrad senior.
Hi everyone, my name is Racheal. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the MSW intern. I'm a student at the University of Denver.
Hey, I'm Naomi. I'm a violence prevention educator intern. I am also at MSU Denver, and I use they, them pronouns.
Thank you all so much. And yes, I should also mention I use they, them pronouns. So today we're going to kind of jump into the topic, and all of us have had this conversation, right? This is everyone in this meeting has been having conversations about Tiger King, and I think the majority of the country has been having some really interesting and sometimes lacking conversations about Tiger King. So we're definitely going to be jumping into some of the issues we see with the show. But first, I want to kind of tackle the narrative structure. I know that for myself, there doesn't really seem to be a very clear narrative structure. Would y'all agree with that? What are your thoughts?
I kind of feel like it's a little all over the place. Like I couldn't necessarily suss out what it was supposed to be about. Like there's so much happening that it's hard to pinpoint what we're actually talking about, which I thought was animal abuse.
Absolutely. Personally, I have trouble being like, so what was the documentarian's like goal? Like I don't know what their goal was with this documentary, which is usually the opposite of how documentaries are done. There's usually like a very clear goal in mind, like some sort of awareness raising, and I didn't see any of that. It was mostly like, this is bananas! And that was like the whole thing.
Yeah, I felt very much like it was supposed to be like, oh, we're going to bring you bits and pieces and then wrap it all up at the end. And I was waiting for that wrap up to happen, and it never did. And I was like, I feel extremely unsatisfied by whatever is happening here.
Absolutely. And did you watch that extra episode with Joel McHale?
Mm-hmm.
Did anyone feel a sense of resolution? Great, just glad it's not only me.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely not for me. The only reason I started watching the documentary was because I kept seeing these memes about Carole Baskin killed her husband. So I was like, oh wow, like I wonder who this person is. This must be like, maybe this Tiger King person like revealed this, villain woman, and now they're investigating this person. And then I started watching it, and I was like, I'm confused. Only from what I can tell, one episode is about this woman who supposedly killed her husband. But there's so many other issues and going on in this documentary, from like animal abuse and the violence towards women and just so many things. I was like, I'm confused why this is the only thing we're all focusing on my media pages. So yeah, I was very frustrated by the documentary, and I was just like, I was not a fan.
Absolutely. So that kind of like puts us perfectly into that next topic that we wanted to cover, and kind of like figuring out like, how do the men portray themselves, and how do they portray Carole, and how does the documentary portray Carole? Because there's almost a hint of some of that goodness right before that turned into villainization.
Yeah, so something I had noticed in the documentary was like she was going to like the courthouse and lobbying for animal rights, like not breeding, animal trading, if I remember correctly, and just raising awareness, and that seemed really awesome. I was down for that. I love animals. I'm sure many of us do. But then as soon as this topic of like, oh yeah, well, she probably killed this husband of hers and took all of his money as soon as she had the chance, then she was this villain who was just out to ruin all these big cat keepers' lives and, ruin Joe Exotic, especially, was when I noticed a lot of this villainization of her started occurring.
Yeah. I started really noticing that it was a lot of the men that kept these animals were portrayed as like, you know, this is exotic, this is something that's desirable, and then this is like some sort of goal to achieve. And then when they, you know, portray her as somebody who was trying to protect these animals, that she was lesser than, and that she was like, she doesn't know what she's doing, she doesn't know what she's talking about. And that really got under my skin the entire time I was watching it, because they were like, the men keep being portrayed as powerful, and like they you know, they have all this stuff, and that she's trying to take away this like sense of masculinity for them, and that they are violent, and that they are constantly violent towards any representations of Carole Baskin's.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that's really, really interesting is Carole Baskin is technically not gone after anyone in particular, but they've all gone after her with like an intensity and a focus that, while also playing into this persecution complex, right? Like they're like, well, I'm the biggest guy out here, and they're like, literally at one point Doc Antle says they're trying to destroy me because I am this well-known guy who's known for loving tigers and having them love him back. And I was just like, are you? And it's like, are people like trying to destroy you, or are they trying to limit and pass policy and legislation around exotic animal trading and the sale of exotic animals, which, by the way, is still incredibly dangerous no matter who you're talking to. And it just felt so totally ignored that they were all focused on her as a person, and she wasn't necessarily focused on any of them in particular until Joe Exotic started his online video series, where he started saying all of these incredibly violent things. And I think Naomi, you just mentioned this focus on her image. At one point he uses sexually violent language on one of his shows, and I'm not going to repeat what he said because it's really gross, but you know, he's threatening someone with sexual violence on a recording, on a broadcast.
To me, like, as we're talking about the persecution complex that these men have, I think it is very reminiscent to me of how we treat survivors when they come forward post Me Too. And like how it's like, well, she's just trying to do this for attention and money. And it's like, no, we're trying to point out injustice across the board, right? And in this case, it just happens to be like, these people are terrible to animals too. But I think it's very reminiscent of those phrasings that we hear often told to survivors around their experience. And it just reminded me of the same thing, right? Like this man is just being taken down by this woman with no reason to do that. And it's like, no, she has plenty of reasons to feel the way she does.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's another thing. While I think that there is some merit to what some folks are saying about, you know, like Carole Baskin could have used a lot of this money to help with conservation of animals, I also think that if I had the kind of resources that Carole had, and someone was going after me the way that Joe Exotic was, and I was worried for my safety, and someone was literally trying to put a hit on me, this is another thing. Literally, Joe Exotic tried to put a hit on her, and still there's this villainization of Carole. Which is just wild to me, and how that has happened and how that's been portrayed. It just seems like such an uncritical choice by the documentarians, and also like really irresponsible. I don't know if any of you felt how irresponsible that was, or want to speak to that.
Yeah, I think like them speaking about like his literal intentional stalking behaviors of Carole, like, oh, look at her biking path. She bikes that path all the time. We could literally set someone out there, there's no one there. So the intentional stalking behaviors of that, and him, you know, actively trying to go out and find someone to, you know, harm her. And like, how many survivors have, you know, we spoken to that have, you know, and I'm not, you know, who have like experienced that. It's just really scary. And for them, even at the end of the documentary, maybe not providing resources or saying, if you feel like you're experienced stalking, or if you've been harassed online because of all the online harassments you experience, like these are hotlines you can contact. Or, you know, I think is really irresponsible of them, because those are real threats, and who knows if that's been a trauma for Carole Baskin. Because even in the follow-up, I was frustrated because, like, maybe Carole didn't want to cooperate, and of course that's her choice, but maybe she did want to do a follow-up just to check in. But also, was she given the option to? I'd be curious to see.
Yeah. I also think that like when we're talking about those behaviors, not only did they not provide resources, but they almost justified the behavior that he is portraying towards this person, which is like so not, it's like so the opposite of what we do every day, that it's like shocking to see, right? That people encouraging a person like this to do things like that. And yeah, it's scary to think about, like, how many people watch things like this and then like don't have the media literacy skills to kind of pick those things apart.
Absolutely. I really like what you said about like building in a justification and an excuse.
Yeah.
Because when they were going in, they were talking about literally stalking her to find that bike path. They almost talk about like how easy it is. Like, oh, we're just gonna look at this video. That looks kind of familiar. Let's just Google Maps. And like, it's scary how easily they're like, oh, let's just write this off. And then when they go on, they try to be like, oh, well, I didn't do that. This other person in my office did. And they just write it off like it's still okay because they weren't the one to do it. And it kind of ties back, even going before Joe Exotic with Carole's first husband. He kind of dismissed the fact that he picks up a really young woman off the side of the road, and we just think like, this is okay that he kept driving around and trying to talk to her and almost harassing her, and was like, oh, it's okay if you point a gun at my head. Like that, we don't talk about that part of the story very much, where like even before Joe Exotic, there was some questionable stuff going on in Carole's life.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that is really interesting about Carole's first marriage too, is the way that the documentarians set it up was really fascinating when they talked about, for instance, the restraining order that her first husband had filed before he went missing. The lawyer says, you know, like free speech, we don't punish anyone for saying it, we punish them after it happens. It basically is the exact line. And it was so interesting to me that they framed Carole's maybe crime. You know, I don't truly know what happened. I don't know. There's literally no evidence other than what was presented in the documentary, and it's a complete cold case, right? So the way they portray Carole's maybe crime versus Joe's actual, like, documented, for sure he tried to have someone killed crime. I just thought that was so fascinating, and so irresponsible, and it just shows the different ways that we go out of our ways to forgive men, and in particular, I think we go out of our way to forgive white men. I don't think it's a coincidence that for some reason Joe Exotic is now seen as a queer icon, which as a queer person I'm pretty upset about. I'm like, not mine, that's for sure. Because I do think that he's incredibly harmful. And that's not even getting into like the workers' violations and his sex cult, right? Like the next episode, we're gonna get deep into the sex cults. That's not even touching on that part of Joe Exotic or Doc Antle. What have your thoughts been on like receiving Joe Exotic and how he's been portrayed and almost turned into like a working class hero? I don't know if that's what's happening, or I don't know.
It kind of feels like that's how he was portrayed, right? As like just this guy who cares about stuff, and this lady's trying to take him down. It's like, I don't really think that's what's happening here. Like the evidence doesn't point to that being the thing that's going on. So it's just like strange to me, because I think part of the appeal of Joe Exotic and why people are like, oh yeah, is like he's quirky. And it's like, cool, but he's also a bad person. And if we could not give him excuses based off the fact that he wears like fun shirts, that would be cool.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I also think of like, you know, how there's always like those hetero people that are like, oh my God, I have the gay best friend. Like, I think people may view him in the way that it's like, oh my God, I'd want him to be my quirky gay friend, which is also extremely problematic and probably a different type of topic. And he's entertainment to them, which is also problematic because people in the LGBTQIA community shouldn't be entertainment.
Absolutely. I mean, I definitely view him as like a caricature, right? Like he's like this bigger than life character. And like the way everything was cut together definitely feeds into that. And I think there's an article that I started reading, and I'll admit I didn't finish, about like Joe Exotic not being your queer icon, and about how the show has turned queerness into like a sideshow again, which I think is a really excellent point. And I think that we're in a really dangerous point in American history, in the history of the United States, when it comes to representation and the different ways that can impact the violences that different communities face. And it's hard for me to imagine this not having some sort of impact in how people view queer folks. And that really concerns me. And that's not to say that Joe Exotic's queerness isn't authentic and real. Of course it is. Right. And he's enacting a lot of harm, a ton of harm. And he has, in the same way, I know that you all have probably seen a lot of memes about how sometimes gay men will do this thing where they think they're allowed to be misogynistic because they're gay and because they have at least one oppressed identity, and how frustrating that is and how untrue that is. And it almost feels a little similar to that like we're allowed to write off his misogyny because he's gay, which is not how I view it.
Yeah, I had some concerns, like, as a queer person watching it. I was really concerned, as you mentioned, about like how this is going to affect how the queer community is viewed and interpreted after this. And I just kind of kept noticing that they were using his queerness as a sideshow, and that the fact that almost like this manipulation was part of it. And that made me really uncomfortable, because that's not the case. But I feel like that's something that is consistently brought up, is that queerness is used to manipulate. And it just made me really uncomfortable the entire show, and that it was used to show like a lesser than again, with both like the way he treated others and then the way he treated his animals.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree. And I think that's probably one of the most troubling things about the show. And it's hard to pick, right? Like there's all these pieces and they all add up and compound each other. So it's really hard to even say like, what's the most problematic aspect of this show? Because it's all too. This is all real people's lives. And I think that's something that gets really lost in the conversation sometimes, is that there are survivors of these situations living amongst us, and their lives have been completely disrupted by this show. I don't know if y'all caught the part where Saf is in the follow-up interview with Joel McHale, talked about how he keeps getting stopped at like Walmart like 3 to 4 times, like every time he goes, basically. In the middle of a pandemic, people want to go up to him and talk to him in person. Yeah. 1. And then 2, Saf is a trans man, and that was not actually brought up or respected in the documentary. Saf was constantly misgendered. So unfortunately, so much to pick from when it comes to problematic like editing choices. Jenae, you look like you had something to say.
I just didn't even know that until just now. Like, I had no idea. I didn't know that.
Right. And that's a huge problem, is that now Saf has a very public persona that doesn't actually match who he is. He had no control over his own personal narrative. Which, yeah, like I see how angry you look. Like I feel very similarly. Like that's not okay. And that's something that's gonna live on Netflix for who knows how long.
like being biracial and always being misidentified, like for my like racial identity, like I just know how frustrating that is. So like for them being a trans man and being identified as she, and then the follow-up when he was saying, you know what, it's just whatever, it happens. It did like make me sad because like I was wondering, like it just happened so much, like maybe they're just like, you know what, I don't know if it was coming from a place like, well, I know who I am and I'm not going to allow others to make me feel bad about it, or if it was coming from a place of like, I'm just over of trying to defend who I am to people, so whatever. But
I was seeing a lot of with Joe's first husband. I've been seeing a few interviews with him come up as well on YouTube and a few different places of it that he feels that the directors just pick the worst of what to show, because like there's whole parts where he talks about you know, they specifically only wanted the shots where he is shirtless, and that is not something that he chose. And like he has shots where he has like gotten new teeth and he's gotten all these things done, and they have film of that, but they just picked not to show it. So it's really kind of sick to me how they choose how to manipulate these people's lives and stories for entertainment's sake, to be like, oh, look at this guy, we're just going to have him sitting here shirtless this whole time for you to judge. And you know, he wasn't comfortable with that.
It's so interesting how they use like working class rhetoric almost to like make Joe Exotic a hero, but then to shame everyone around him. Because that's how, when you say that, Naomi, that's what I hear, is that like they're trying to be like, oh yeah, like he's just a regular guy, but also look at the trash that he's surrounded by. Like that's the message that I think that the documentarians were trying to send. And especially like knowing everything we know about the meth epidemic, like they very much took advantage of what meth does to a person's body. And we know that addiction is an illness, and no one should only have that side of themselves shown when there's another side, right? And his first husband clearly feels that was the case based on the interviews you've seen.
Yeah, and a little bit of like what everyone else that worked at Joe's Zoo was mentioning, is that they found the job on Craigslist and that it was like a place where outcasts went. And so it kind of built Joe as like this savior complex, that he would bring in unwanted people, or as you mentioned, that they were almost be just, you know, the rejects to come and work on his zoo. So it gave him this, you know, savior complex, that we're like, oh, but look, he's helping these people, so he's not that bad.
But is he really helping those people if he barely pays them and feeds them rotten food? You know, like that.
No.
It's confusing because we're presented both and expected to make a choice, and then without critical skills to make a better choice, the choice people pick is like, oh, he's helping all these people, he's saving all these people, and it's like, well, if you look at the situation they're actually in, he's not doing anything to help those people or those animals. He's doing nothing but helping himself, which is the selfish act. He's not this like selfless person that he was made out to be in this documentary at all.
And to kind of like bring it back to Carole Baskin and how they try to villainize her, how they talked about all the volunteers that she had. And it's like, yeah, like maybe it'd be nice for you to have paid staff there, especially like I didn't hear anything about any paid veterinarians in any of those organizations in the documentary anywhere. So that was concerning for me. But like a way for them to villainize her as well is like, well, she only has volunteers. We at least pay our people. So in a way, I think that also got people to be like, oh, well, she only has volunteers. They at least pay, Joe at least pays his people like $450 or whatever little amount, and he at least gives them rotten meat to eat, which is terrible. I don't see how that's a great comparison. But yeah, just not good. I was very horrified by all the work conditions that they all put their employees through.
Like one of the biggest examples for me within that is like one of his staff gets their arm ripped off, right? By an animal. Yeah. And goes back to work, what, four days later? That's not something we should be celebrating. That's not something to be excited about. That's terrible.
Absolutely. And we know that staff had no benefits, right? Like, like I'm sure that was part of the decision to not go through with reconstructed surgery and 2 years of reconstructed surgery, because who was going to pay for that? Like, our medical system wasn't going to pay for that because we don't have that, unfortunately. And he certainly was not providing benefits. And another thing is that it's actually for true nonprofits, right? Which Carole runs a nonprofit and the others run for-profit businesses. Volunteer systems are not at all uncommon. It's actually pretty normal. And, you know, like, I do think that everyone should be paid for their work, of course, and that we should value all forms of labor and make sure that people are getting just compensation and able to meet all of their basic needs and more. And, like, did anyone miss the barn, like, setup for Doc, and how, like, 8 years ago, apparently, like, they were living in cockroach infested, not really getting paid, working, like, I don't know how many hours, like,
it was like 12 to 18
hour days. You don't see your family. I mean, we're going to get into all of how they control folks in the next episode, so we might be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but like, this is going to actually be a perfect segue into the next episode. Because when we talk about the way that Joe Exotic targets vulnerable people, I think that we see a lot of patterns there that we often see in abuse. So in that case, I think this is a perfect time to kind of wrap up, and I'll be giving out just a couple of notes. So thank you so much, Naomi, Racheal, and Jenae, so much for joining us for today's episode, and I'm really excited to have you back to talk about the next episode, which is going to be Tigers and Lions and Sex Cults, oh my. We're very excited to tackle the sexual coercion that is completely unaddressed within the series. And when you're looking for different ways to support survivors in this next week, I am hoping that you'll come to our social media pages, our Instagram and our Facebook, at Phoenix Auraria on Instagram, and you'll find a calendar there for the PCA Spirit Week. It is our very first Spirit Week, and when this episode comes out on Thursday, there'll be 2 days left, but we'll be posting all kinds of things in the next couple of months to continue supporting survivors from afar. So please make sure that you're participating in that, and please subscribe and share. And sorry about my stumbling. Thank you all so much, and thanks for listening.
Tune in next week for Tigers and Lions and Sex Cults, oh my.